Chapter 6. The Second Wave War. The Industrial Revolution launched the second wave of historical change. That wave transformed the way millions of people made a living, and war once more mirrored the changes in wealth creation and work. Just as mass production was the core principle of industrial economies, mass destruction became the core principle of industrial age warfare. It remains the hallmark of the Second Wave War. Starting with the late 1600s, when the steam engine was introduced to pump water out of British mines, when Newton transformed science, when Descartes wrote philosophy, when factories began to dot the land, when industrial mass production began to replace peasant-based agriculture in the West, war, too, became progressively industrialized. Mass production was paralleled by the levée en masse, conscription of mass armies paid by and loyal not to the local landowner, clan leader, or warlord, but to the modern nation state. The draft was not new, but the idea of the whole nation in arms, armies citoyennes, was a product of the French Revolution, which roughly marked the crisis of the old agrarian regime and the political rise of a modernizing bourgeoisie. After 1792, writes Yale historian R.R. Palmer, a wave of innovation revolutionized warfare, replacing the limited war of the old regime with the unlimited war of subsequent times. War before the French Revolution was essentially a clash between rulers. Since that event, it has become increasingly a clash between peoples. It increasingly became a clash of conscripted armies as well. Bayonets and cotton gins. In the United States, it was not until 1862-63, during the Civil War, in which the industrializing North defeated the agrarian South, that the draft was imposed by both sides. Similarly, in Japan, half a world away, the introduction of the draft came shortly after 1868, when the Meiji Revolution started that country on its path towards industrialization. There, the feudal samurai warrior was replaced by the drafter soldier. After each war, as tensions eased and budgets were cut, armies might revert to volunteers once more, but in crisis, mass conscription was common. The most dramatic changes in war came from the new standardized weaponry that was now produced by mass production methods. By 1798, in the United States, the inventor of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney, was asking for a government contract to undertake to manufacture 10 or 15,000 of arms, each stand consisting of a musket, a bayonet, a ramrod, wiper, and screwdriver. Whitney offered as well to make cartridge boxes, pistols, and other items by using machines for forging, rolling, floating, and boring, grinding, polishing, etc. This was an amazing proposition in its time. 10 or 15,000 of arms, writes the historian Jeanette Mirsky and Alan Nevins, was a notion as fantastic and as improbable as aviation was before Kitty Hawk. War accelerated the industrialization process itself by spreading, for example, the principle of interchangeable parts. This basic industrial innovation was quickly put to use, turning out everything from handguns to the pulleys needed on sail-driven warships. In pre-industrial Japan, too, some of the earliest primitive mechanization was for the purpose of producing arms. That other key industrial principle, standardization, was also soon applied not merely to weapons themselves, but to military training, organization, and doctrine as well. The industrial transformation of war thus went far beyond technology. Temporarily, ragtag armies led by the nobility were replaced by standing armies led by professional officers trained in war academies. The French created the état major system to give officers formal training for senior command. In 1875, Japan created its own military academy after studying the French. In 1881, the United States set up the School of Application of Infantry and Cavalry at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. A barrage of memos. The division of labor and industry was reproduced in the rise of the new specialized branches of the military. As in business, bureaucracy grew. Armies developed general staffs, written orders replaced oral commands for many purposes. Memos proliferated in business and on the battlefield alike. Everywhere industrial-style rationalization became the order of the day. Thus, writes Marion and Susie Harries in Soldiers of the Sun, their impressive history of the Japanese Imperial Army, the 1880s were the years when the Army evolved and entrenched a professional establishment capable of gathering intelligence, formulating policy, planning and directing operations, and recruiting, training, equipping, transporting, and administrating a modern armed force. The machine age gave birth to the machine gun, to mechanized warfare, and to entirely new kinds of firepower, which in turn led inevitably, as we shall see, to new kinds of tactics. Industrialization led to improved roads, harbors, energy supplies, and communication. It gave the modern nation state more efficient means of tax collection. All these developments vastly enlarged the scale of potential military operations. As the second wave surged through society, first wave institutions were eroded and washed away. A social system aroused that linked mass production, mass education, mass communication, mass consumption, mass entertainment with increasingly weapons of mass destruction. Death on the assembly line. Relying on its industrial base for victory, the United States during World War II not only sent 15 million men to war, but mass manufactured nearly 6 million rifles and machine guns, over 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 71,000 naval vessels, and 41 billion, not million, rounds of ammunition. World War II showed the awesome potential for industrializing death. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jews in true factory style, creating what were, in effect, assembly lines for death. The war itself led to the slaughter of 15 million soldiers from all countries and nearly twice that number of civilians. Thus, even before atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, war had reached unparalleled levels of mass destruction. On March 9, 1945, for example, 334 American B-29 bombers hit Tokyo in a single attack that destroyed 267,171 buildings and killed 84,000 civilians, wounding 40,000 more, while flattening 16 square miles of the city. Massive raids also hit Coventry in England and Dresden in Germany, not to mention smaller population centers all across Europe. Unlike Sun Tzu, who held that the most successful general was the one that achieved his ends without battle, or with minimal losses, Karl von Clausewitz, 1780 to 1831, the father of modern strategy, taught a different lesson. While in later writings he made many subtle and even contradictory points, his dictum that war is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds reverberated through the wars of the industrial age, beyond the absolute. Clausewitz wrote of absolute war that, however, was not enough for some of the theorists who followed. Thus, the German general Erich Ludendorff, after World War I, expanded the concept to total war, in which he stood Clausewitz on its head. Clausewitz saw war as an extension of politics, and the military as an instrument of political policy. Ludendorff argued that for war to be total, the political order itself had to be subordinated to the military. Nazi theorists later extended even Ludendorff's notions of total war by denying the reality of peace itself and insisting that peace was merely a period of war preparation, the war between wars. In its larger sense, total war was to be waged politically, economically, culturally, and propagandistically, and the entire society converted into a single war machine. It was industrial-style rationalization carried to its ultimate. The military implication of such theories was maximum destruction. As B. H. Little Hart wrote in his History of Strategic Thinking, for more than a century the prime canon of military doctrine has been that the destruction of the enemy's main forces on the battlefield constituted the only true aim in war. That was universally accepted, engraved in all military manuals, and taught in all staff colleges. So absolute a rule would have astonished the great commanders and teachers of war theory in ages prior to the 19th century. But those ages were still largely pre-industrial. The concepts of total war and mass destruction were widely adopted after the Industrial Revolution because they fit the ethos of mass society, the civilization of the second wave. In practice, total war blurred or completely eliminated the distinction between military and civilian targets, since everything supposedly contributed to a total war effort. Everything from arms warehouses to workers' housing, from munition dumps to printing plants, was a legitimate target. Curtis LeMay, the general who led the Tokyo raid and later became the chief of U.S. Strategic Air Command, was the perfect apostle of the theory of mass destruction. If war came, he insisted, there was no time for prioritization of targets, nor the technology for precise targeting. To LeMay, writes Fred Kaplan in The Wizards of Armageddon, demolishing everything was how you win a war. The whole point of strategic bombing was to be massive. LeMay was the keeper of America's nuclear bombers. By the 1960s, with Soviet and NATO forces facing each other in Germany, small battlefield nuclear weapons were added to the arsenals of the superpowers. War scenarios pictured the use of these weapons and the deployment of vast tank formations rolling forward over a nuclear and chemical carpet in the ultimate war of attrition. Indeed, throughout the entire Cold War following World War II, the ultimate in mass destructive power, nuclear arms dominated the relationship between the two great superpowers. A deadly doppelganger. As industrial civilization reached its peak in the post-World War II period, mass destruction came to play the same central role in military doctrine as mass production did in economics. It was the deadly doppelganger of mass production. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, however, as third-wave technologies, ideas, and social forms and forces began to challenge second-wave mass society, a fresh breeze began to blow. It was, as we've seen, becoming clear to a small group of thinkers in the U.S. military and in the Congress that something was fundamentally wrong with American military doctrine. In the race to extend the range, speed, and lethality of weapons, the outer limits had already, for all practical purposes, been reached. A struggle against Soviet power had led to the nuclear standoff and insane threats of mutually assured destruction. Was there a way to defeat Soviet aggression without nukes? The development of modern war, the war of the industrial age, had reached its ultimate contradiction. A true revolution in military thinking was needed, a revolution that reflected the new economic and technological forces released by the third wave of change.